Good morning. My name is John Packer. I'm the Director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center here at the University of Ottawa. Delighted to be able to welcome you here for the first in a series of talks, which are in fact the beginning of a program led by our new Gordon Henderson Chair for Human Rights, Professor Meredith Tureta. We have today a eminent speaker who's come from south of the border, and let Meredith introduce him, but allow me just a couple of words as we also are still near the beginning of the academic year. First of all, I'd like to draw your attention to the display which we have in the room. And as we are quite absorbed in our country now with the effects of the so-called refugee crisis, but the ongoing refugee time that we are living in, it's good for us to recall not only that this is not new, but that there have been incidents in our long history in Canada where we've been called upon or had the opportunity to assist others in need. And this display specifically recalls the experience of assisting the so-called boat people, where Canada took a disproportionate, compared to many other countries, variety of refugees from Southeast Asia who have integrated and become dynamic and highly contributing citizens in our country. And for that, we were actually recognized internationally with an award of the Nansen Medal, which is named after Norwegian who inspired the idea of providing facilities for people seeking refuge, specifically a Nansen passport, a means by which to travel. So I think it's very timely, it's very appropriate. This is a nice environment. I encourage you to spend a little time, if you wish, later, or come back to look at and read the display. Let me also say that we're delighted to not only have this specific program, but to have Professor Tureta with us. She joined us a couple months ago, and she's located here as part of our scholarly community. And we also invite you to tell others and to come to our different events. You can see them advertised on our website. We have information. You can also sign up outside to be put on our listserv, should you wish. So without further ado, let me just make note that this is recorded, the talk, but also at the end of the remarks by Professor Watenpaugh, you will have the opportunity to pose questions or comment, and we would ask that you do so from the microphone so that it is recorded directly into the recording. With that, Professor Tureta.
Thanks, John. Thanks for coming. Hopefully I just was over in Omid Milani's class, his 8:30 class over at the Lees Annex. Keith was actually going to do a panel with me over there, but I should mention that he's not feeling tip-top shape, so he slept in a bed this morning to recover. So hopefully that'll be fine. But anyway, the point is that I asked those students to come over, but since they're coming from Lees, maybe they'll show up a bit later. So thanks for coming, and it's my pleasure to introduce Keith Watenpaugh, who I actually met
2002
in our first teaching position, right? It was my first, certainly, yours as well, at Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York. And he was a very collegial colleague at that time, and we've remained in contact since then. I think the last time I saw you, Keith, was actually at a Mesa, maybe 2005 or something like that. So we haven't seen each other in a long time, but I'm certainly very glad that he could come to be the inaugural speaker for the Refugee History series, the Gordon F. Henderson Refugee History series this year. And he's a historian. He's trained as a specialist of the Middle East. He's working you work in at least 5 languages, correct? Mm-hmm. Arabic, Turkish, Armenian, French, and English. And certainly the quality of that linguistic breadth shows up in his work. Here he's just published Bread from Stones, The Middle East in the Making of Modern Humanitarianism. Last year it came out, 2015, with the University of California Press. And it is bears the quality of being the second best book in the West. Won honorable mention in the AHA Pacific branch, which is all of the states and provinces west of the Mississippi. And it is also a Amundsen Foundation book in the humanities. Okay. So the other reason that I thought that he would be a great kickoff for the event is that he is a founding director of a human rights program. The founding director of the human rights program at the University of California, Davis. And we look forward to talking with him more about that hat that he wears over there during our lunch together. In addition to this book, he's published, your first book was your first book, right? Being Modern in the Middle East, Princeton University Press in 2006. He's published in the American Historical Review, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, the Journal of Human Rights, Social History, and Humanity, among others. I just want to mention a couple of things about Keith Watenpaugh that may not appear in usual introductions. Namely, the fact that already at Lemoyne College, I think you had been there maybe 1 year before I arrived, 2 years before I arrived, and already when I had arrived, he'd managed to put together, find the way to put together a peace and global conflict studies, is that what it was called, that got our students on that campus very engaged and even got members of the faculty engaged as well, so that was no small feat. And I mentioned that just to demonstrate the consistency, I guess, in the commitment to human rights scholarship. Even at that time, that was before we even knew that human rights history existed. It was before Samuel Moyne's book was published, before Lynn Hunt's book was published. The other thing that I wanted to mention was Keith had sort of an effect on my intellectual trajectory, namely one comment that he made, which was, we both came out of the 90s, I think, in our programs, and it was at the United States in that time. We both did our work in the United States, you at UCLA and I at the University of Wisconsin. And at that time, everything was very area studies oriented. And I remember one day Keith saying to me, I want to sit at the big kids' table. Or something to that effect.
No, that's exactly right.
Yeah. So and so we started to talk, and I think as I've watched your work over the years, I've been inspired by the way that even as a specialist of the Middle East, you have managed to become, to enter into conversation and dialogue with people outside that specific field, even though you, again, are working in multiple languages and you remain true to your particularist interests. So, and then the last thing I wanted to mention is that it was our great pleasure to share a role in mentoring Chris Gradian. I always called him Chris Gratian, and it's Chris Gradian.
I call him Chris Grayton.
Okay, you call him Chris Grayton. Okay, so anyway, if you haven't heard of him, you will. He is an Ottomanist on the make. He was our undergraduate in 2004, and he left, and he's now a postdoc at Harvard, and he's taking up a position at the University of Virginia. So he's, I think that it's...
We're like his mom and dad.
We're like his mom and dad in some ways. And it's really one-of-a-kind student. So he's also going to make a name for himself, I think, in Ottoman history as well as, because I think he surpasses you in language competency now, and also in environmental history. And he also happens to be running, I think, one of the most successful history podcasts. What is it called? The
Ottoman History Podcast.
The Ottoman History Podcast, which I've already mentioned to Viviana, because it's certainly a model for academics wanting to think about going into these new formats. So, should I tell the part about the beer pints? There are no students here, so I won't. So, there are no students here yet. So it's my pleasure to welcome Keith Watenpaugh.
Thank you. So am I live? Okay, mic is hot. Thank you, Meredith. That's probably the most unique introduction I've ever received in my life. I'm just going to sort of jump right into my talk. I have been feeling very much under the weather, but the moment I crossed the border into Canada, I started feeling better. So Yes, yes, on all sorts of levels, on all sorts of levels. So I've come from Manitoba. I was over in Manitoba for a couple days. I gave a talk about my book at this marvelous little not little, giant bookstore they have downtown, and which we don't have things like that very much anymore in the United States. And then a talk at their history department where my colleague Jennifer Dwake is chair in Middle East history. So it really seems like a vibrant and vital program, and I had a chance to also visit, of course, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, which is it's an interesting place worthy of further study. So what I want to begin with, and I'm going to be talking today about issues in the evolution and the change and the politics of humanitarianism, in the period of the First World War, trying to understand basic questions about who gets helped and why, but also a much larger question, which is what was the impact of genocide on the formation of modern humanitarianism? So I'll be looking first at humanitarian responses to famines and floods and locusts in the Eastern Mediterranean in the period up to about 1915, which then sort of fell to the wayside as the reality of the Ottoman Empire's attempt to destroy the Armenian people became much clearer. And I want to start with this image. This is we can drop the light some, couldn't we? Mm-hmm. Or we would lose video.
Yeah, I have a hard time seeing you, but it's okay. I mean,
yeah, let's just drop the lights a little bit, and I'll move over closer to it.
I'll just film the screen and I'll hear your voice.
Okay, and I'll stand over closer to it.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a wonderful picture from the Library of Congress's collection, something I encourage you to go to. And it's all, there's no copyrights. It's for legal use, for academic use in particular. And this is a photograph of the Tigris River as it passes through downtown Baghdad in the period just before the outbreak of the First World War. And you can see it's a really vibrant, alive, wonderful city. There's trees growing on the banks of the river. There's these boats. And of course, this is summer. The water is very, very low. The dikes are built to hold the water back during flood. But of course, you can see the dikes aren't doing so well on this side of the river. But I want to call your attention to the other fact of this picture, which are the telegraph lines. Baghdad went through a marvelous period of urban renewal and reconstruction in the late 19th century under the Tanzimat. So it was a city that had very modern elements, very traditional elements, but it was a vibrant metropolitan city. And in December of 1914, the war had just started. December of 1914, there were some early winter rains, across Anatolia into the Caucasus that melted all the snow that had fallen to that point. And so a wall of water sort of rushed down through Mosul towards Baghdad. And the governor of Mosul had sent a telegram to the governor of Baghdad telling him to prepare, and he did not do so. And on Christmas Eve, a massive flood overtook the city. The waters rose and the dikes failed, and storehouses full of supplies that were to feed the people of Baghdad over the course of the winter into the spring were flooded and destroyed. Wheat, sugar, barley were ruined. Houses were destroyed. 20,000 families were left homeless. It was a terrible flood. And the American consul of the city wrote to Morgenthau, who was the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and said, can we use some of those Red Cross funds that you have access to? And Morgenthau, who's a name that in the United States people will be very familiar with, his children have been very prominent in American democratic political politics since then, wrote to the local American Red Cross in Istanbul and said, can we send some of this money, some of your money, to Baghdad? And this is the response he received. The Red Cross funds at our disposal for relief are all designated by the givers for European war relief. No doubt that the suffering at Baghdad is acute, but so it is on a colossal scale in the 7 European nations at war. We are bending all our energies to meet the immeasurable demands for assistance that come to us from those countries, and we know that our help, considerable though it may be in the aggregate, goes but a short way in effective relief of the misery. We do not feel that it would be justified in attempting Baghdad flood relief, which would mean the assumption of another burden at a time when we know that the tasks already assumed are greater than our resource. And indeed, no help was forthcoming to Baghdad. And the flooded waters accelerated a typhoid epidemic that was going up and down the Mesopotamia at the time, and more people perished. But at almost the same time, Secretary of State Lansing, who was one of these giant figures in American diplomacy, and I assure you, I'm not a diplomatic historian, although I'm all of a sudden quoting lots of diplomatic history here. One Rabbi Abramovitz of St. Louis sent a communication to Secretary Lansing and said, quote, "Received today cablegram from Central Committee of Jewish Population that the Jewish population of Palestine, that they are starving." Almost immediately, he writes back, quote, "I would say that the Red Cross would be glad to cooperate in meeting the needs in Palestine as described by Consul Glasbrook." So in other words, why Jerusalem and why Baghdad? And I think it would be too easy for us to say, oh, well, there's a big Jewish community in America, and they were only concerned about Jews in Palestine. That's the only place there were Jews. That's why they did this. Now, there's a little bit of a problem with that because, of course, those of you who study Ottoman history, which I think may not be anyone else in this room, one of the facts of Baghdad at the beginning of the 20th century was that it was about half Jewish. It was one of the largest Jewish cities in the Middle East, alongside cities like Aleppo, Damascus, and Salonika in the Balkans. And in fact, this is a photograph taken almost at the same time as that first photograph of middle-class Jewish homes that have been built alongside the river, because during the summer, that's the only part of Baghdad that has any chance of sort of escaping these 40, 50-degree days that Baghdad experiences. So it wasn't about that. And in fact, I would argue that it was about what Jewish settlement, in particular American Jewish settlement, meant at the time in Palestine. I don't say this as a defense of supporting one over the other, but to explain or propose the idea that humanitarianism on its very basis may present itself as being universal and for all, but it's controlled by political ideas, it's controlled by access, it's controlled by politics in the host country. Now, we've all lived through a period of time where that seems so obvious to us now, looking at the decisions being made about which refugees to help and which migrants not to help. But this was even the case at the beginning of the 20th century. Similar dynamic takes place in the support of another of the Middle East's great cities. And that's that's Beirut. Not only did the Middle East get massive floods in the first years of the First World War, but it also experienced another great biblical plague, that of locusts. Now, it's always good to remind people what locusts are. So, we have grasshoppers here in North America, right? They're about this big. But every once in a while, some kind of environmental condition turns something on in the grasshopper and they become locusts. Like Algeria has locusts all the time, right? And they become locusts. In 1915, and then again in 1916, one of the one of the largest locust plagues in contemporary history took place in the Middle East. Right? And here you can see, I hope you can see, this is just a rock fence on the outskirts of Tripoli covered with locusts. And they're about this big on those rocks. And in fact, there are descriptions from the time, you can see here, of the sky being filled with locusts. And that the locusts would move across the sun and block it out from view, creating nighttime during the day. Well, these locusts ravaged much of the Eastern Mediterranean region, but especially so in the area around Beirut. And Beirut, too, then fell into famine, much like Jerusalem had. However, it was also pushed into famine by the fact that the British and the French navies had blockaded the port of Beirut, preventing food from entering the city. The French and the British were at war with the Ottoman Empire. One of the standard techniques of warfare was, in fact, blockading ports. But again, unlike Baghdad, Beirut experienced a massive humanitarian effort. Why? What did Beirut have that Baghdad didn't have? Well, one thing they had was an immense American presence in Beirut, a long time, generations-long American presence, a presence that primarily in the form of what was called then the Syrian Protestant College, but is now called the American University in Beirut. And it was just that. It was a small liberal arts and technical college that had been established in the 1840s. Generations of Ivy League educated men had gone to teach there, as well as their 7 sisters' educated wives. And they had created amongst the Lebanese population a real constituency for what that they believed were receptive to American ideas and values. And so they were concerned that that population would be destroyed by the famine. And so engaged American support through various networks to bring food and supplies to Beirut, including a Christmas ship, the Vulcan, that they filled with goods, but eventually was unable to dock at the port in Beirut. But Beirut was also, the efforts in Beirut were also supported by the fact that there was a constituency of Arab and Lebanese Americans in the United States that advocated on its behalf. Again, something Baghdad didn't have. And amongst these, you go and you look at the correspondence to the American Secretary of State, and it's filled with letters from like the Detroit Lebanese Arab Association, or from the Arabs of Brooklyn, or also, and most prominently, from the Lebanese American poet Khalil Gibran, whose probably name may be familiar to some of you, demanding American assistance on behalf of the Lebanese people. And so this assistance manifested itself in soup kitchens and feeding stations and so on. This is an image taken of a feeding station on the outskirts of Beirut that had been established by the faculty of the Syrian Protestant College. You can see the kids. So I think what's happening in this picture is it's really cold too. I mean, the kids are really dressed up. So they all take a little pot from home, and then they would go to the feeding station. It would be filled up with a soup or a broth, usually barley broth of some kind or lentils, and then they'd take it home to their family. And the effort of the American University faculty was successful as long as they had access to resources. But beginning in 1917, and especially after the entrance of the United States into the First World War, those efforts collapsed. And in fact, Lebanon witnessed some of the worst and most horrific scenes of starvation in the history of the region, including at least reports of people eating the bodies of other people. So humanitarians have to make choices. Who are we going to help and why? But in this case, when looking at the form of early humanitarianism during the First World War in the Middle East, it seems to have been driven, at least in part, by a specific American project in the region of transforming the Near East, as they would have called it, into a modern and moral community, using the opportunity of famine, starvation, and locusts to at least accelerate some of that project. Now that said, I mean, this is always the great conundrum with humanitarianism, right? It's like, well, I mean, this is a nefarious colonial project. Well, is it? If it helps people, if it saves lives? But my argument is always that it can be both simultaneously, that it's not an either-or situation. Now this ideology of care, this humanitarianism a la Americaine, was controlled by many of these ideas, and also a sense of caring about people that Americans could understand. But these projects were very small. I mean, the population of Jerusalem was well under 100,000 people in these days. Beirut maybe had 60,000 people. That these efforts were very limited in scope. You could imagine filling up a boat in New York Harbor, sending it to Beirut, and being able to feed most of the city for a couple months. I mean, this is how relatively small the problem was. But the American workers, the other relief workers associated with the Rockefeller War Relief Board in Istanbul and others, began to notice in the spring of 1915, a much larger humanitarian problem looming on the horizon. And that is the events, let's go back. It doesn't want to move properly here. And I think those are the events that we have now, as historians, have organized into something we call the genocide of the Ottoman Armenians. Now, this is a map that was produced in 1916 by agents of the Rockefeller War Relief Board. Now, the Rockefellers, right? These are, maybe 50 years ago, you could say, you're a Rockefeller, That would mean you're very wealthy or something. The Rockefellers were probably, especially John D., was probably the wealthiest man in US history, maybe in world history. Maybe Mansa Musa was wealthier. You never know. Rockefeller was so wealthy that it was estimated that in his personal control was between 2% and 4% of the US GDP at one point. And this is the days before income tax. So you really have no way of understanding what was going on. Rockefeller, though, felt terribly guilty about the horrible things he did to get wealthy, and so he always wanted to help people. This was his idea. And if you look at some of his very early correspondences stored at the Rockefeller Foundation archives in Sleepy Hollow, New York, they're often filled with these personal pleas to the old man, asking him, can you help, put our church's roof was destroyed by lightning, can you send us $50? Sort of things. And it became inefficient for the Rockefeller Foundation to administer grants in such a fashion. And so they established a foundation that created a bureaucratic and business mechanism to bring grants in, assess them, fund them, and follow up. And in fact, created in the process the model for most of the ways that non-governmental organizations and governments solicit and administer grants today. It really begins in this period. And it was adapted by Carnegie and Ford, and then eventually by the US government and other governments around the world. And so part of that process, though, was that they didn't believe what they were being told by many of the organizations that were asking for money. They wanted to see it for themselves on the ground. So during the First World War, the Rockefeller War Relief Board created a network of essentially intelligence agents to understand humanitarian problems throughout Europe and in the Middle East. And one of their most active outposts was here in Istanbul. And this map is critically important to understanding at least the origins of the Armenian Genocide, but how it was understood in the West. One of the things that happens when we study genocide is we often hear as an excuse for inaction statements like, oh, we didn't know it was happening, or we didn't think it was so bad. Well, Western, European, German, Armenian, and Ottoman observers knew immediately how bad it was. And this map shows, it's very touching to me, it shows the routes of deportation of Armenians. And accompanying this map was a generic account of what was happening in 1915 as the Ottoman state moved to exterminate its Armenian population. And these were gathered from first-hand reports of people in the field. And they would talk about how, for example, in the city of Sivas, an order would go out from the Ottoman gendarme, or the Ottoman governor, excuse me, for Armenians to prepare to be relocated for their security and their safety, right? And I always tell my students, if someone ever says that to you, you need to run away. Right? No one ever relocates you for your safety. That they had 2 days to accumulate, to take their belongings that they could carry and to liquidate their property, which of course meant that they were peniorized almost immediately. So men, women, children, old people, gathered their things, tried to find a donkey and a cart or something to put their things in. They would sew jewelry and gold into their clothing to try to hide it. Hopefully they could sell their property at not too much of a fire sale price, and then they would assemble. And immediately upon assembly in like a central square or a field outside the town, the men, meaning boys from 14 to 55, see, I'm almost old enough to escape deportation, to 55 would be gathered up, and then no one saw them again, right? They would be taken usually to a field or to a ravine nearby, executed. Sometimes they were put into labor battalions and then executed later. Now, of course, when we study genocide, the separation of genders is a very important aspect of an early phase. Then the men and women would be marched from Sivas, and in this way they actually had to walk much of the way until eventually they arrived at the city of Aleppo, which has been a little bit in the news in the United States lately because our libertarian candidate for president didn't know what it was. They would get to Aleppo, where there was a massive concentration camp, where often they were held. And sometimes in Aleppo, those Armenians who were seen as having some valuable artisanal skills were turned into slave laborers in camps in Hama and Homs, further into greater Syria. But others were systematically marched in this direction. And this sort of blob is the Syrian desert. And they were marched into the desert along the Euphrates River, where in camp there were a series of camps, and the population dwindled as they moved through the camps until finally, and they didn't know about, that one thing they didn't know about at the time was in the city of Deir ez-Zor there was an actual extermination camp that took place. Now, all these names would be familiar to you because these are areas that have been fought over by the Islamic State and the Syrian government over the last couple of years. So this map illustrated a much larger humanitarian problem than the starvation in the Eastern Mediterranean or even the flooding in Beirut. One that had so many different elements. It had starvation, but it also had rape and pillage. It had the destruction of entire communities and homeland. It also had the disruption of people's lives, their movement and displacement. And I think a way to think about the challenge and what's unique about the effects of genocide for the origins of modern humanitarianism is found in one quotation from one of the Rockefeller Foundation Board's observers. And this is this observation that when he was writing about this map, he said, the deserts south of Aleppo is filled with a struggling mass who had seen the foundations of all possible living destroyed in such a way that their initiative and resistance had disappeared. And when you read that, it's very disturbing, but when you read that, it also calls to mind some of the writings of the current theorist of choice by many anthropologists, who's a guy named Agamben, who came up with this idea of the homo sacer, this guy who, the idea of a person who has had much of their humanity stripped away from them, and all that remains is the idea of bare life, just being alive. So in many ways, what was happening to these Armenians was that as they were being displaced, they were being taken out of place. Now just think about this for a second. This part of Anatolia is green and lush. It's like parts of California or upstate New York, and this is the desert. They're being separated from their families, their communities, places they know, forms of agriculture they're familiar with, from their workshops, from their networks. They're being stripped of those things that keep them in a kind of human community and being placed in a desert where the only people who are prepared to take care of them are the people who have displaced them. So it creates a very unique humanitarian challenge for any kind of international organization interested in trying to help. And I've been very attracted to the idea of the homo sacer to try to explain this, the response. But as Meredith said, I want to sit at the big boys table.
I didn't say boys.
Yeah, but I said boys. And part of that is that those of us who work on non-Western fields need to be responsible for creating theory as well. And one of the ideas I had was that Armenians in this period also elaborated a way to think about this. Now, I want to assure you that not just Americans were helping the Armenians, but plenty of Armenians were helping the Armenians during this period. In fact, there are major organizations sponsored by very wealthy Armenians from Egypt, and in fact, Near East Relief, the organization that I'll talk about here in a moment, was supported by Armenian organizations in the United States as well. So Armenian intellectuals, writers, doctors, and others who were thinking about what was happening to their people coined a new word to explain how these people were different from other kinds of victims of war, violence, or famine. And one of the first appearances of that description occurs in response to an episode illustrated in this photograph. What is this? What does this look like? What does this look like? What is that? It's a refugee camp. Why do you know it's a refugee camp? Tents, right? But what about the tents? How do you know this isn't a Boy Scout jamboree? What about the tents? They're all the same and they're in order, right? They're in ranks. Plus, you also may not have seen, but you have here the people in uniform, sort of in positions of authority, right? And this is an image of the camp of the Musa Da Armenians. In late 1915, as we said before, knowledge of what was happening to the Armenians was widespread in the empire, even amongst Armenians, right? So there were phases of deportation. And the Armenians of Musa Da, which is this little mountain, means Mount Moses, or in Turkish, I'm trying to remember which language it was in Turkish, and it's near the city of Antakya, or Antioch, and Aleppo. And it's famous because the idea is that Al-Khidr helped out Moses after he was not permitted to enter the Holy Lands. And the Musa Da Armenians were kind of a tough mountain people, and they got word that they were going to be deported, and they'd heard that everyone who'd gotten deported before, no one had ever heard from them again. And so they decided to resist, and it was one of the 3 moments of resistance to deportation in the entirety of the Armenian Genocide, which is, in fact, I find quite surprising. And it's mostly testament to the sophistication of the Ottoman state's efforts, that very little resistance took place. And so they retreated up this mountain, and they had guns, and there was a spring on the top of the mountain. I was on that mountain a couple of years ago, and they were able to resist for 40 days. And there's a famous book in German called The 40 Days of Musa Da by Franz Werfel, in fact.
There's a movie as well.
Yes, it's not so great, but. And so this picture is also important to me because my wife's great-grandparents are in there somewhere. So she's descended from the survivors of this. There may never have been my wife if there hadn't been resistance, which I've always thankful that someone did this. So they couldn't hold out much longer, and they eventually were able to escape the mountain and get onto a French cruiser that was sailing by and taken to Port Said in Egypt, where this encampment was built for them by the British occupation forces of Egypt and the Armenian Red Cross Society. And it was tough. The people of Musa Da remember that about half of them died of typhoid. And they also, many of the men were recruited into the French, the equivalent of the French Foreign Legion that was fighting in the Eastern Mediterranean and fought in what was called the Légion Arménienne. But one of the men who was taking care of this group was a prominent Armenian doctor from Cairo named Dr. Salpi. And Dr. Salpi wrote a book called Alikner Yev Chiliakner. Chiliakner. And he used this very specific Armenian word, chiliak. And chiliak is a word we don't have in English or in French or in many Western European languages, but it mostly translates as the hulk of a ship that has washed up and broken up. So imagine that you've got a ship that's been on the sea, it's crashed into the rocks, it's broken apart, and it's just this hulk on the beach. Right? We might say flotsam or jetsam, maybe in English, is a close idea. And he applied that idea to these people, not in a pejorative sense, but in this idea that they had been so broken up that they could only survive through the assistance of others. And when he meant broken up, he meant not just physically broken, he meant separated from everything they knew. And in many ways, this is very unprecedented. It's such a large number of people to be displaced, to be made refugees in such a short period of time, and to be confronted by that. And in fact, since then, this word has entered into the lexicon of Western Armenia, the Armenian spoken by Armenians of the former Ottoman Empire, and places like Beirut, Aleppo, Los Angeles, as the word designating survivors of the Armenian Genocide. And so one of the ideas I have is that it's this chiliak idea, this chiliak concept of the human being who has all the tendons that connect him or her to society being torn away by genocide, which produces a very specific challenge to humanitarianism, which is unique. It requires assistance that is not just blankets and medicine, but a whole series of other techniques of restoration and what we might call restorative justice in a contemporary sense. And in fact, that's the challenge that was taken up by the leading American humanitarian organization in the region that formed in 1915 in response to the Armenian Genocide, and that's American Near East Relief. So American Near East Relief organized in this period. I'm not going to go in, that would be a whole other lecture. But it was very successful for its day. It brought together some of the wealthiest men who've ever lived in the United States, in New York in particular, with old school Protestant missionaries who had worked in the Middle East for many, many years, with sort of political organizers, representatives of organizations like the NAACP and other civil rights groups, and social scientists, to create a new kind of humanitarian response that would not be driven by sectarianism or communal ideas, but actually focused on, and this is the core of part of the argument of the book, addressing not just suffering, but the root causes of human suffering. And Near East Relief did very well. They mobilized all the tools of Madison Avenue. They hired a bunch of madmen. That's where it comes from, right? They hired a bunch of madmen, and they made these most beautiful posters. I'm sure you've seen some of them at some point. Churches, schools all over the United States and Canada would contribute to its cause, and by 1917, they had raised over $30 million in 1917 dollars, which would have been an immense amount of money. And were successful in helping those Armenians first in areas that have been liberated, or not liberated, but captured by the Western Allies, and then with the surrender of the Ottoman Empire, embarked upon a massive project on behalf of the Armenians. Now let me move to a discussion of that project, because that's where I want to take my argument now, in understanding what humanitarianism often tries to do but can't, and why humanitarianism can never really be a substitute for politics, for citizenship, or even for human rights. So, World War I is over, 1918. Bunches of promises have been made to everyone during the First World War, right? And one of the promises that had been made was that Woodrow Wilson had made a promise to achieve national self-determination for peoples, including, amongst the Middle Eastern peoples, primarily, almost exclusively, the Armenians. And this led to the creation of what was called, at least temporarily, Wilsonian Armenia, an Armenia whose borders were drawn by the President of the United States in consultation with experts. And I'll just outline it here. So here's the Black Sea. I mean, basically, first, this is where modern Turkey will become. This is Syria, Iraq, Kurdistan also overlaps. And then this is, at this point, it's Russia, but it very shortly will become the Soviet Union. So Armenia, as proposed by Woodrow Wilson, goes like this. It would have a seaport, it would have mountains, and it would constitute many of the pre-World War I provinces of the Ottoman Empire in which the plurality of the inhabitants were Armenians. And so the idea was, quite simply, to solve the problem of the Hılyak, of the displaced person, of the destroyed Armenian nation in the parlance of the time, by doing what? Giving them a nation. The idea being that the establishment of a nation with national citizenship would answer all the problems and difficulties that the Armenians had faced. Well, spoiler alert, this doesn't happen. Right? There's a series of very, very bloody, brutal wars following the end of the First World War in Anatolia, which is remembered by contemporary citizens of Turkey as the Turkish War for Independence, the Greek disaster, the Armenian War, the war against the French, that established the borders of what is today Turkey. And part of that was a squeezing of Armenia into a tiny little statelet that was then placed under Soviet rule and became the Armenian SSR, which is a fraction of any original Armenian state, and really not a viable entity for the promotion of especially an American agenda for Armenian development, right? Because it went under Soviet rule. So this this did a whole series of things to the great project, including creating whole new waves of refugees. Without the option of a state, and the forcing of Armenians into exile in primarily Arab lands, Near East Relief and other humanitarian groups were faced with this problem of trying to recreate an Armenian community in exile with the available tools they had. So I'm going to talk about just 3 of those tools and then try to conclude, so I can get you guys off your phones. And the first of these tools was something that predates the Near East Relief. Was begun by Near East Relief and then follows it into the League of Nations. And this is a phenomenon that was not well understood of the Armenian Genocide just until the last 6 or 7 years, which was that during the genocide, there wasn't just mass killing, but there was also the mass abduction and trafficking of Armenian women and girls and children during the process. And as I narrated before, the caravans would pass through territory. They would be lightly guarded. Brigands, local people, and others would just go and take, if they could, goods, and as far as they were concerned, children were also goods to be taken. So it was a very violent and a very brutal moment. Young people were taken into the households of Bedouins and Turks and others, where they were converted, often made 2nd, 3rd, 4th wives, or forced to bear children against their will. And in the period after the war, a massive process of recovering these children was undertaken by Western organizations and by Armenians themselves. And this is a document from that process housed at the League of Nations Archive in Geneva, documenting a couple of the thousands of cases of this. And I'm just going to zoom in. This is one of the rare pictures of a young man who was abducted when he was quite young during the deportations. He was about 7 years old. And then he was forced to work as an agricultural slave for years. And he talks about being transferred from household to household. And eventually he was able to escape to Aleppo in March of 1923. And then there's an entry on the following page that says that he found his brother living in Aleppo, which is a very nice story. But the more common stories were stories like this. This is the story of Mariam from the city of Aintab, who had been taken as a pre-teen and then sold as booty, and then sold from household to household, forced to bear several children, and then eventually was able to escape to Aleppo. And the records indicate that the facility people believed that she had been so severely damaged by the experience that the possibility of rehabilitation was very difficult. It's hard to see from this picture, but she is quite young. But if you come up and look at her photograph, she looks like she's in her 40s or 50s. She's just been horribly aged by the experience. She also has facial tattoos, which I don't want to overemphasize because that also happened to Bedouin women at the same time, but made, because of sort of the what we call the double patriarchal bind, made it very difficult for her then to reintegrate into Armenian society because she was marked as having been a slave and being raped, right? So this was part of that process of the restoration of the Armenian community through humanitarian means. Probably in those days, it would have been described as almost a biological effort to repopulate the Armenians. We would think of it more in terms of trying to help restore the cultural and social integrity of the Armenian community. Now, one thing I want to just sort of emphasize one thing before I move on, which is this open question about a post-genocide, which is, do you actually ever restore the community? In fact, what you're really doing is you're building a new community that resembles, to some extent, the pre-war one. And this is true for diasporas and other communities of displaced people. I mean, one imagines, we have 5 million Syrians living outside of Syria now. As they try to recreate a community outside, it's not going to be Syria. It's going to be something else. And so as much as there was this effort to rebuild an Armenian nation in exile, it really wasn't that. It wasn't a return. It was some kind of it was new, but it resembled enough to be credible. The second, I know I'm going a little bit over time here, I apologize, but this is interesting. So, in the 1920s, when it became very clear that Armenians were not going to go back to Turkey, what became Turkey, especially following the denationalization of the Armenians by the Turkish Republic of Turkey, the French mandate authorities in Lebanon and Syria began a process of what they would call installation définitive, final installation or final solution for the Armenian problem, in part by by building housing for them. But what's interesting, and I think important to understand, is that they didn't build housing for them in Aleppo or in Beirut or in Damascus. They built housing for them over the top of the refugee camps where they were living. So instead of creating a process of integrating the Armenians into the fabric of urban life of Syria, they built brand new, beautiful neighborhoods with homes with indoor plumbing and electricity at a time when most citizens of those other cities had neither, in order to create these very unique, very separate, very ghettoized, if you will, neighborhoods. Why? The French policymakers saw this as a way to help confront sort of rising Arab nationalism by helping develop constituencies that were opposed to it. But also from a humanitarian perspective, this was understood as a way to maintain the Armenians as a people by helping them resist assimilation. And in fact, before the war in Syria, these refugee neighborhoods in places like Aleppo were extremely distinct places. Armenian bookstores, Armenian restaurants, schools, languages spoken on the street were Armenian. That they'd been a very successful experiment in community preservation. But the final element, and this is, oh, come on, Pete. There we go. That I want to focus on and conclude with is What I see as perhaps another option that humanitarianism has when dealing with the kinds of challenges of a post-genocide period, especially when faced with a failure to reestablish a nation state, a failure to bring refugees back into the states from which they were exiled, and that is just to forget about the problem. It's just to figure out a way to make the problem go away. And in fact, the Nansen Passport is in part that. Right? It's an incredibly important document in the lives of individual Armenians and individual Russians for whom it was developed. I'll talk more about it in a second. But it's also a way to forget about the problem by letting Armenians and others just move and become part of other societies. Nansen, who was celebrated here in one of your wonderful banners, was a polar explorer. Actually, his day job was a fish neurobiologist who had been sent by the League of Nations to figure out what to do about Russian refugees from the Russian Civil War. And he created the Nansen Passport as a way for refugees to move. And it's based on a fairly simple principle, which is that if you're a refugee and you found some place where you're reasonably safe, like Istanbul, in the case of the Russian refugees, but there's no work, and you're getting poorer and poorer, and you might have heard that there's work in France, or there's work in Spain, or you have relatives in North America, but you're afraid to move. Why? Why are you afraid to move from Istanbul? Why are you afraid to move? What might happen to you if you cross a border? Well, anytime you cross the border, you're vulnerable to what? Refoulement. It's a good French word. You are vulnerable to being sent home to the place from which you have fled. And so what the Nansen Passport does is it provides to the refugee assurance that if he or she crosses a border into a state that recognizes that passport, they will not be returned to the place that exiled them in the first place. And so it's a document that doesn't provide rights, it doesn't provide anything along those lines, but rather helps the refugee move in an attempt to find work or to just find a place to create a new life. And this is a passport created for a guy named Onig Ispengian. And one thing to note is that Nansen passports were only created for two groups of people. They weren't a universal refugee document. Only Armenians and Russians received them in the interwar period, with a small expansion to Assyrians in the late 1930s. It's nothing like the post-World War II refugee regime. And this is Onig Ispengian. And Onig was from the Turkish city of Smyrna, or Izmir. And he wasn't very old when the genocide happened, but had become a young adult in the 1920s. And it's not clear to me if he was with his family or he was traveling with a brother or something, but this passport was issued in Belgium, and he had another one that was issued in Germany. And when I saw them, he had stamps and passport stamps from all over Western Europe. And then eventually you see him enter Great Britain at Bristol, or you see him at Dover, and then leave Bristol, and you see an entry visa into the United States, where he disappears, right? He doesn't have to have a passport anymore. And I was always very curious about what happened to him, because I knew he was, his granddaughter had donated this passport to a research center. So what had happened to him? So I Googled, and eventually I found that he was part of a medical school class at Columbia University during this period. So the reason why he was moving from place to place to place in Europe was trying to find a place to go to medical school. And so he finally found a place to go to medical school in the United States, and he married and established a family and was presumably successful. But he was no longer a problem. He wasn't a problem for international humanitarianism. He'd ceased to be part of this attempt to reestablish in Armenia. He was now forgettable as a problem for international humanitarianism. And something that really emphasizes this is part of this passport here. It says, the present certificate is not valid for return to the country which issued it without prior permission to that effect contained in it. But the more important clause is, it will cease to be valid if the bearer enters Turkish territory. In other words, you can never go home. So, thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
The microphone is right over there. And
How do you want me, where do you want me to stand?
oh, just right there is fine. So we'll turn on the lights. The microphone is on.
Does anyone have any questions? Or do I have the, yes, John, okay.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Watenpaugh, for your illuminating presentation. It was intriguing. I've worked for many years all over that part of the world, and I still do. And I work on a number of related subjects, so I was intrigued. But I want to query you on one small phrase, and you won't, hopefully you won't consider this nitpicking, because I think it's actually fundamental. But at one point you stated, and see if I get this correct, you said that Armenia would, the Armenian nation, not to give the Armenian nation a nation. If you just ponder for a moment that phrase, not to give the Armenian nation a nation.
Or a state.
Not or a state.
And a state.
In fact, you mean a state.
Right.
So this conflation of the notion nation and state is hugely problematical. And you know, of course, that it was Woodrow Wilson who came up with the idea in his 14 points of exactly this idea of giving a nation a state. And in fact, it also coincided with Stalin's idea in the Nationalities Principles booklet he wrote, 1913, for Lenin, to unpack the conundrum of global or universal labor and unity with the diversity of existing political, ethno-political communities. You probably also know that we don't actually know what a nation is in terms of, Stalin gave us some definitions, but in legal terms, we're not sure what it is. I can tell you that. But even if we think we know what it is in socio-political terms, it's hugely contested. Those who think it has a biological character, the Volk, for example. Those who think it might just be anybody within certain heritage or elements of belonging and so forth. In any event, I want to query you on this problem because it still today is exactly present. I'll give a few examples in a moment. But isn't this idea of exactly trying to coincide or give, by the way, who gives, but give a nation a state, the core of what we should be engaging with? Because you talked about root causes and trying to address the root causes. In fact, I would challenge you to tell me or us whether it's actually possible in practical terms to give every nation a state, which was Woodrow Wilson's promise.
Well, when I used to study nationalism, one of the ways I would answer your what is a nation question is, as a historian, I'm less interested in what I think a nation is, and I'm much more interested in what the people I study think a nation is. So at that moment, the notion of nationhood was, of course, very fluid, but amongst nationalists, and I think that there were, in that period, there were some intellectuals who I think were much more familiar with ideas that they had encountered in Western Europe about what a nation was. And I think, at least in their mind, they believed that they had a very solid idea of what that meant. And it was both institutional, and it was cultural, and it was social, all at the same time. And so humanitarianism and nationalism and this sort of Wilsonian idealism all sort of become this mishmash of ideas in which the world has been confronted with this horrible war, and so they think, well, how do we keep the war from ever happening again? So it's a pragmatic solution. It's not about some sort of utopian solution saying, how do we keep the world from going to war again? Well, we create nations, and we put people in their nations because that's the, if everyone's in their own nation, then they won't go to war, and if we have minorities, we can make special arrangements for them so that they won't
which spectacularly failed in the post-First World War.
And that's why we
era.
have a Second World War. Right?
Yeah, and gave rise to the Second World War.
Right. And so the failure to create a state in which Armenians were the dominant population and enjoyed full citizenship created the failure, or the condition of failure, that required institutions like the League of Nations, and this is part of an article I wrote for Sam Moyne's journal Humanity, created a condition in which the League of Nations, as a transnational institution, began to adopt for itself, or for the Armenians, some of the attributes of a state. It kind of acted like a state on their behalf. And that was also very clumsy, because that's not what the League of Nations was supposed to do.
So I want to challenge you right there. You said the failure to give the Armenian nation a state.
Well,
and I would challenge that, both factually, conceptually, historically, because your deposit of that is that a state is the solution for the nation.
I don't think it's a solution.
Okay, because just to finish my query to you, I mean, we know that the contemporary issues, even across all of Central Eastern Europe, Ukraine, all of the areas you're talking about, are actually still playing out. Hungarians lament Trianon. Right. We know what that was about and so forth. But we also know what happened with Pakistan, India. We know what Israel-Palestine is.
But I'm not advocating the formation of nations.
No. So just the historical question, which is important in terms of analysis, including the notions that, and the words that are actually using. Nation state, that's a pretty massive conflation. So is the problem, even analytically, this relationship, or is it something much more profound? That's what I really want to get at, which was the protection of the affected communities with regard to not only their maintenance as individuals and communities, but their capacity to live a life in fulfillment of their own ambitions, aspirations, and so forth. Is that more the problem? That's what I would like to ask.
Yes. I mean, yes. But the issue, I think, in that period, rather than imagining like what we would like to imagine, like a rights-based formula for protecting individual human rights, the idea was, and this seems to me to be somewhat valid, was that in the absence of a state with which to protect the rights of the individual, I mean, in other words, a state whose primary job was to protect the rights of Armenians, Armenian rights would not be protected, right? And so that's what they believed.
To protect anybody's rights.
Well, but this is what Armenians believed, and why they advocated for a state, is they believed that without a state, their rights as Armenians would not be protected. And when they were in Syria and Lebanon, which were under French mandate, it took an act of the mandatory authority to make them citizens. Even though, and this is one of the weird ironies, most of them had been born 60, 70 miles north of the cities where they were living in northern Syria. So it was only an accident of where the railroad went that defined the border between Turkey and Syria, that they didn't have rights when they were in Syria, but they'd had rights when they were in the province of Aleppo, in the period before the war. So it's not, I mean, what's critical to understand is it's not that I'm advocating saying that humanitarianism should create nations. It's more that in that moment, most believed, humanitarians, Americans believe this, Lebanese believe this, Armenians believe this, Young Turks believed this, that you had to create a state, and hopefully corresponding with the nation, in which you were the majority, and you could make sure that that state operated to protect you, your property, your way of life. And for these Armenian refugees, that ceased. As refugees, they were wholly dependent upon the host society to extend to them protection, which was not something that they could ever count on. So we can probably move on.
Well, first, just a quick comment on John's question. The idea that the nation state became the framework for rights and claiming rights is a pretty modern phenomenon. And before recognizing individuals and the Western philosophy as the sovereign, we never needed that nation state in order to claim rights. So the idea of giving a nation state as a solution for their problems is a Western prescription for the problem in the first place. Secondly, it is flawed extremely. And it is the root cause exactly of the many problems that we witness in the Middle East, to say the least, these days, where the French and the other Western countries thought that they have this mission to give certain people territories. Those territories we were talking about in the northwest part of Iran, they were conquered by the Russians in the first place, and they were taken away from Persians. And then someone else came and decided to give that land to Armenians to solve their problems. This has been, I think, part of the problem itself. But my question is, how much of this Western and American humanitarianism you think is sincere, and how much of it is hypocritical? At that time, when the Armenians were persecuted and they were killed in groups, and many of them were forced to migrate out of their hometowns. The idea, firstly, Armenians initiated hostility between themselves and the Turkish Empire because that's not true. Well, that's not true. It depends who you listen to.
But continue your question, please.
And then we witnessed that in a very recent example in Khojali, by giving Armenian.
Come on, let's stay in the past. Let's stay in the past.
The Western approach to humanitarianism is in its entirety.
Can I just try to answer your question before you sort of becomes a political diatribe?
Sure.
Thank you. I think it's always interesting to try to figure out the motives of people who have died 100 years ago. Were they sincere? Were they not sincere? Were they hypocritical? Were they idealistic? And I think we have opportunities to try to understand, for example, why relief workers did their jobs. I mean, they wrote letters home to their folks, and often they wrote about a deep sense of attachment to the people that they were working with. And on the other hand, there's often an incredible difference, and this is even true today, between what happens in the field and then what happens back in New York or in Washington, D.C. or Ottawa in terms of decisions being made about what happens in the field. And so as a historian, when you're looking at this, if you go in to just try to assess, did they really think that they were, were they hypocrites or were they genuine, that's just a non-starter to historical inquiry. I think what you really have to begin to think about is, what you can read what they're telling to their donors, which are often seem to be really extraordinarily provocative things. In the case of Near East Relief, some of their American-based propaganda to try to raise money from churches and so on revolved around the most horrible representation of attacks on Christian women by Muslim men. On the other hand, in the field, you have someone like Karen Yeppe, who's running the Aleppo Rescue Home, bringing in young women and men from the desert, whose chief collaborator was a local Bedouin sheikh who was interested in creating a more harmonious environment in northern Syria. And, you know, she worked day to day with him. So, you know, I think it's a very complex issue that if you reduce it just down to, you know, Western imperialism and hypocrisy, you're really doing a terrible job.
That's one way to look at it and to be critical of what's going on out there, to say the least. Because if we detach ourselves from what is going on morally and we dismiss what is happening there in a moral sense, then we may misunderstand historical facts. So that's one of the reasons. And the other...
Are you suggesting I'm dismissing the...
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that if we do this, then we may misunderstand things. I'm not suggesting that you did this. But the other thing that is about this solution of giving a nation a piece of land and creating them states in order for them to recognize their rights and so on and so forth. So with these forged, manufactured states that we have in the Middle East, these states such as Israel, Armenia, those people who were supposed to be given a piece of land or territory, we witness mass atrocities perpetrated by them and committed by them. Do you think there is a link between this solution, giving a nation a land, a territory, and can we say that the aftermath of this would be...
Beyond the scope of what I've been talking about. I mean...
Well, you talked about the root causes of
I'm saying that there were... No, I didn't say that.
Situation.
Humanitarians...
Is there a link between these two?
That in the early 1920s, there was a widespread belief that the better the correlation between a national identity, which of course is constructed and contestable, and territory, the better the correlation, the better the possibility for peace and security. That was just that's what was believed then, right? And you know, there are people in the Eastern Mediterranean region right now fighting and dying to protect these allegedly forged borders that they've all grown up with and seem very real to them. These borders are especially real if you're a refugee trying to cross from one to another. And then you have the Islamic State, who's decided on the basis of, you know, writings of Rashid Ridda and others that these borders are illogical and immoral and un-Islamic.
Thank you.
Hi. Am I good? Dr. J. Brian Scott. I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. When I leave these events here at the Human Rights Center or at SIPS, I always feel like I'm a smarter person. And so I'm going to leave here thinking I'm a smarter person. But you've challenged me. I give frequent lectures on international development and humanitarianism. And I usually start with after the Second World War and the Marshall Plan. And now you force me to go back much further. You're contributing to making my lectures much better.
Thank you.
And I thank you for your responses. This is how dialogue should go. This is what we do in academia. This is how we should act. And so thanks again.
Sure.
And now I have to read you.
Well, the one thing the direction I would point you in is that point 4, which was the major post-war development project from the United States, which really put the United States in the business of technical assistance, right? Which is a whole other interesting theory and phenomenon. Really saw itself as an inheritor of the Near East Foundation, which was what Near East Relief turned into. And in fact, sort of there's another part of this story that I don't talk about as much, but I think is very interesting, is that Near East Relief during this period was really aggressively operating on behalf of the Armenians in an advocacy sense. And that became increasingly politically difficult for them to do if they wanted to stay in the region. And in the 1930s, after the problem of the Armenians became forgettable, they moved very strongly out of the business of advocating, for example, for women's access to education and other kinds of emancipatory projects, to working very specifically with established governments. So in fact, switching sides, if you will, in order to preserve their access to the region. And perhaps the most egregious example of that is their collaboration with the Shah of Iran in the creation of his modern academic system throughout Iran. And there's another book called Bread from Stones Like Mine, which is actually catalogs. It was such an evocative thing. I entitled my book first, then I found that one later. So, and yet there's yet another one about putting rocks on dirt, which helps improve wheat yields as well. So you read this book, and they're like, we've done all these great things in Iran. We're educating all these people. And you never see any moment of reflection. This is right after the coup, right? This is right after the United States overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran, right? And these guys who had been living in the Middle East for a generation, Americans living there for a generation, working, they spoke Persian, they knew what was going on. Nothing. They didn't reflect on it at all, about this very important notion that sometimes international development can make a dictator's life a lot easier. There's no reflection on this. And this abandonment of these kinds of advocacy principles of this sort of interwar humanitarianism is very troubling. And it's only been in the last 20 years, I would argue, and this sort of growing, very hesitant attempt to create and no one actually really understands what this means, but rights-based development, right? This sort of rights-based development idea, which is now standard for USAID. It's only in the last 20 years that these ideas have come back together. And it only came back together because of the end of the Cold War and so on as well. So that's something to think about, right? Which is, why did we go down this path where we just said, oh, we'll just do technical education because everyone will be better if that happens, and just not worry about their rights at the same time, right?
Thank you.
So after that comment about the big boys table, I just want to make sure that you will take questions from women.
Yes. I would really hope so.
And the implication was not, therefore, that women were not welcome at the big table.
Oh, no, they were not welcome at the big boys table.
In
the old days?
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time,
but
they were
we are
not.
no longer,
That's
in your
right.
mind, living in those times. So I just
Well, those of
wanted
us from California weren't welcome at the big boys table either. So.
Okay. I just wanted to qualify that. So I do have a question, if no one else does at this moment. Okay, then I definitely will ask this question first. So I think that one of the interesting things, and it's kind of poignant too, is the suggestion that you end up with, which is that the procurement of this, or the procurement of this passport, this Nansen passport, is conditional upon never being able to return home. And so for me, I read in that, as your endpoint and your conclusion, a suggestion that with humanitarian aid comes an eraser, a giant eraser, an effacement of identity of a kind. Certainly a collective identity, and perhaps also an individual identity. And so I wanted to ask you more, I guess, is that the way, am I reading your conclusion correctly?
Yes.
Or am I reading too much into what you're saying?
No, that's correct. I mean, that we even see echoes of this today, that when you indicate to the UNHCR that you want to be resettled, you give them your passport of your state, or what you're still a citizen of, and that's gone. So in this case, if Onik had gone back to Turkey, he could have been killed. I mean, he wasn't really, at that point, that interested. But who knows what would have happened, 5, 6, 7, 8 years later. But that is the case, is that the process, it's not a I hate to see it as a process of erasure, because you're still preserving elements of, in a diaspora, you still preserve elements of the homeland, of what we call culture and so on. You also have the phenomenon where the diaspora becomes very conservative in the way it understands that culture, and it's very difficult for it to elaborate and grow that culture in the diaspora. It feels like if it does it, it's letting someone down. But it's just not that this is like it's kind of a triage-based solution to the problem, where you're just going to try to put a bandage on it, get the person, and move them on. And that's what was going on here, because this was the misunderstanding of what humanitarianism could do in the interwar period, that it could actually affect some kind of justice. It wasn't a justice, it's not a way to achieve justice. It's a way to preserve life, to try to preserve some kind of cultural integrity, but it's not about justice, right? And so I think in the interwar period, when people look to these institutions to try to do that, they put a great deal of hope and a great deal of valuation in them. It proved futile, just like the League of Nations, right? Is that there was some implication, idea that would be helping to achieve justice, right? And then they tried to fix it after the next war. So I mean, I think that's absolutely right.
Anyone else? Okay.
I'd like to query a bit more and ask a really purely historical question.
Sure.
Based on, you said in response to one of the questions, they believed.
Okay.
So I'm interested to know who the they are and who exactly they are and exactly what they believed in historical context. This
Can you
idea,
remind me of what was they believed, what they believed?
So that Armenians, for example, in order to get their rights, needed their nation to have a state.
Well, I mean, okay. So
hang on.
Yeah, sure.
Let me finish,
Sure.
please.
You want specific names?
Normally, in the spirit of discovery, we allow an opportunity. So, I mean, my understanding not only of history, but of engaged in the matters. So, for example, human rights is not mentioned in the Charter of the League of Nations.
No.
It's absolutely silent. It wasn't even a very broadly utilized idea, as far as I understand at the time, at least in the context of politics. I mean, real international relations. There may have been groups and so forth. So the concept of minorities actually was more national minorities, a particularly European idea, not necessarily a Western idea, as I mentioned, Stalin and the socialist universalism. But now, allow me to give you a little anecdote. So I have discussed personally with Jalal Talabani, Masoud Barzani in Iraq, if they could list all the things they're seeking for their community, their people, and they got them all. And they got them all not in the context of a federal state, and not even in the context of a separate state, would they take them? I can tell you the question put them off guard, because they're absolutely so committed to the idea that they, in order to get all those things, they must have at least a very loose federation and probably a state. And this is the aspiration. And yet if I ask them, and I have been there and conducted discussions in Kirkuk, for example, where this is a highly mixed society, where in fact the local language of the market for the longest time was Turkoman, and where there's a high degree of intermarriage historically. This precedes, and by the way, not only Christians and Jews, who are basically all gone now, you had for thousands of years dynamic, I believe for a very long period of time, quite intermixed dynamic communities, I think. That's my impression. And by the way, even people who changed, Sunni Shia, even recently. So if the issue is about not just humanitarianism, but actually satisfying people's needs, interests, and aspirations, I go back to my question, and that's why I'm interested in the answer historically. Is it accurate? Who exactly? Because if I look at most of the rest of the world, Africa, Asia, and so forth, they don't understand this nation state, and they absolutely reject the idea of minority, national minority, indigenous peoples, and so forth. It's not part of their experience. So it seems some kind of a projection of 19th century power. And I can tell you, because I've discussed this also with Paul Wolfowitz, for example, or Richard Pearl, who had very specific objectives, or ambassadors, American ambassadors in Baghdad after 2003, who talked about Shia Sunni Kurds as constituting all of Iraq, not even realizing Kurds, of course, are Shia Sunni, and by the way, also Yazidi and others. So completely conflated, confused about who was who. So my question, again, historically, is who exactly believed, and what exactly did they believe at the time that you're describing? Because I have a sense that this is a projected, essentially, power paradigm of 19th and early 20th century Western power. That's what I think is historically the case. I'd be interested to know.
But I think you're underestimating the political and intellectual sophistication of Middle Eastern peoples in that comment. I mean, the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, which was founded in late 19th century in Baku and Tiflis and Paris, was one of the members of the Socialist International and had thousands and thousands of members throughout the world. They wanted an Armenian state, and they wanted to make it the greatest socialist Armenian state possible. And they ran the Republic of Armenia for 2 years, from 1920 to 1922. So that's one of the days where an Armenian organization that had been thoroughly educated in, at universities in Imperial Russia and in Istanbul and in Western Europe. They also were the Armenian General Benevolent Union, which was a bourgeois party headquartered in Cairo, who also believed that they preferred Armenian autonomy in the western provinces of the Ottoman Empire, which was advocated by the Russian dragoman to the caliph, Andrei Mandelstam, was actually very important in the larger formation of human rights ideology. At the end of the 1930s, he wrote a series of books that are often seen as critical in establishing some of the French ideas about droit de l'homme. And you had Arab nationalists from the period too, who wanted to have an Arab nation. And you certainly had Turkish nationalists, some of whom I think had an idea of preserving the Ottoman Empire, but as a binational nation of Arabs and Turks. You had others, primarily those who were educated in the Russian Empire, who had faced the discrimination and the terror of being a Caucasian Muslim or something, who fled then to the Ottoman Empire and thought that the only way to preserve Islam and the Turkish identity was through the creation of a nation state that could confront Russia. So I mean, we always underestimate in this period how, unless you sit and you read the indigenous, the languages of Arabic and Armenian and what was also an indigenous language, French, what people were writing and talking about, you tend to underestimate the degree of political sophistication, and that also how powerful to them the idea of a nation was. And for us, it seems so, it's like, well, what is this thing, right? We from Anderson forward, we tend to underestimate the evocative power of it in people's lives. And, so the other issue is that, to my mind, I think the confidence in the validity of the nation of 100 years ago is very different than the way people think about it today, even people who call themselves nationalists. And also I think that, Talabani and these other Kurdish leaders are very politically sophisticated and understand that they've gotten much more out of being part of Iraq over the last few years than being not part of Iraq. And they're pragmatic. But if I gave the impression that somehow I was advocating, that the only way that you could possibly survive was being in your own nation, I think that was not what I was implying.
Can I just add on to this a bit? I mean, I think, is it also the understanding that the shortest route to rights are through citizenship?
Right.
And it seems to me it's not at all, I mean, as a historian, again, there's nothing here that's been said by Professor Watenpaugh that seems surprising to me, because I have looked at rights claims from this very same period, the 1920s in particular. So it seems that there are all kinds of nationalist projects going on, Zionism being one of them, for instance, Pan-Africanism. So there's an idea that the cause of rightlessness can be addressed if we can create a sort of identity-based nation in which citizenship will be conferred to people lacking it, the protections of citizenships. So it seems to be, this is why, for instance, W.B. Du Bois shows up at the Versailles Conference in 1919, along with the Zionists and the Pan-Arabists who are there. So it seems very, very much, the conversation of the era, and different even than the kinds of conversations around these things going on in the 30s. Yeah. Or repeat questioners and people who haven't asked it yet.
So by the way, citizenship and rights, citizenship is one of the inconsistencies within human rights, and is one of the flaws in contemporary human rights. And I'm just going to make a quick comment about one of the statements of Professor Watenpaugh. You mentioned that maybe John is underestimating the sophistication of people in the Middle East. It shows that it tells me that there is a correlation between sophistication and nation states, as if this form of governance is a better form of governance, or is the ultimate solution. There is a little bit of triumphalism, it kind of idea, a romantic idea about nation state, which I completely disagree. And I think this is an essentialist Western hegemonic way of looking at people there. And I don't think there's any correlation between sophistication, being sophisticated, and nation state.
Nothing. Okay, so any other questions? No? I keep looking at you. I expect to have a question. Okay, so I guess we'll go ahead and bring this to a close. I want to thank those of you who came for coming, and I want to thank you especially.
Thank you.
Professor Watenpaugh, even though this wasn't the best day for you to be doing this, for having powered through and done it nonetheless. And I also did want to announce that on the 20th of October, we're going to continue with our next speaker in the series, who is Umut Ozu, who actually wanted to be here very much today, but it's a coup for Ottawa. He's just been hired at Carleton University in the Department of Law and Legal Studies. He's a legal scholar. He also works on what used to be the Ottoman Empire. And he will be coming next 20th of October. It's also a Thursday morning from 10 to 2 a.m. And the title of his talk will be International Law, Population Transfer, and a History of the Present. So I invite you to not only come and attend that, but also to announce that in your networks as you see the information being posted on our website, as it will be shortly before the event. So thank you very much.
Thank you.